Hello everyone and welcome to today's session, Intermodal Data Analytics for Brakes, Lights, and Tire Optimization. I'm Hal Pollard, the Director of Education at IANA. This webinar is brought to you by IANA's Maintenance and Repair Committee. We have a great panel lined up for you today. I'm pleased to introduce Cliff Creech, the Group Manager for Intermodal Maintenance and Contracts at Norfolk Southern Corporation. Now Cliff is doing double duty for us today. He brings his experience from Norfolk Southern maintaining a large fleet of chassis. He also brings his experience as chairman of IANA's Maintenance and Repair Committee. The Maintenance and Repair Committee is active on a number of fronts, not the least of which is tracking FMCSA safety data. Now, I'll kick it over to Cliff to introduce the rest of our panel and get us started with an introduction to the topic.
Thank you, Hal. All right, Steve Bryant is with us. He's the president for Visualo, a Samba safety company. I'm going to go through a number of metrics that he's put together for the panel. After Steve, we'll have Ronnie Holland. He's the Director of Safety at TCW. And Tim Smith, Vice President of Safety with Hub Group Trucking. Hal, are you moving on to the structure, or do you want me to take that slide?
Hey, go for it.
Okay, so we started off with a bit of introduction, and I'll continue on that here in just a bit. But when we finish with that, we'll shift, and Steve will drill into the numbers a little further, and then we'll open it up with a perspective from Ronnie and Tim, and then I'll offer a Norfolk Southern perspective on use of data in our proactive systematic maintenance programs, and then a general discussion and QA session. All right, so the slides you're going to see here are all from the Maintenance and Repair Committee meeting that we just had in Long Beach. We've had a partnership between FMCSA and IANA going back now several years, where FMCSA provides the industry with updates on its inspection programs for intermodal chassis. Just as a plug for IANA and attending the conferences, it's a great place for you to get updated information on how the industry is trending on these important safety initiatives. This slide starts with showing you the full chassis inspections, level 1 or level 5. Of course, the level 1 is the full inspection that could include the driver, whereas level 5 is really an equipment-only inspection. And FMCSA has been very clear that they're increasing the number of terminal inspections or level 5 inspections as a focus. And you can see through the first half of 17, it's basically 1 in 4 inspections, that full inspections of a chassis was a terminal inspection. This is really the big punchline in the FMCSA presentation every year, and you're seeing the out-of-service rate in those full chassis inspections from the FMCSA data. And, you know, it's pleasing to see that there's a downward trend here, and, you know, that first half 2017 number below 16%, something that has taken a lot of effort from a lot of companies throughout the industry to achieve, but you know, something I think we can all be justifiably proud of. These are the top out-of-service violations that FMCSA reports on intermodal chassis, and you know, it's not unfamiliar to see that it's lights and brakes and tires, same things that it seems like we all talk about throughout our careers in maintenance and in safety, but really, this presentation is going to give us a chance to go beyond these numbers that are at industry level. And when we move over to Steve's material, you're going to be talking with someone who packages that so that you can really leverage it in your own company. This takes that same data where you had a tractor inspected as part of a intermodal chassis roadside inspection or terminal inspection and measures what was found on the tractor. And you can see, again, the trend is downward. You did have a slight movement up in 2017 first half, but still the number is below 17% for the tractors. And then, again, and this is just a subset of the tractor inspections, but the one involving a chassis, you can see the largest out-of-service violation here, brakes. And then, of course, going down through everything here. And this, like it says in the bottom, this is first half 17 data. This is the last slide on the IANA material, and now I want to turn it over to Steve to go through his material. Steve?
All right, great, Cliff. Thank you. That's really interesting stuff. So Appreciate the opportunity to be here. This is always an honor to be able to do these panels with some truly great experienced experts in the industry. So I have the easy job here today. So what I'm going to do, as we were discussing, kind of getting started on this earlier this summer, really, when we started conceiving of this webinar, the proposition is that all of the industry is particularly burdened with vehicle maintenance violations. But the challenge to intermodal operators, we believed, was even more burdensome. And specifically when you focus on brakes, lights, and tires, what I call BLT, we'll get into that more here in a second. So that was where we started, is can we find in the data a story to tell? And so that's what I'm going to take just a few minutes here to do, is to kind of untangle a storyline that walks through the data. So this is all coming from the FMCSA. This is from a database that I'm sure we're all very familiar with called MICMIS, the Motor Carrier Management Information System. So Vigilo has always maintained a historical database. We have about 10 years worth of that data. There's a ton of detail in it. So that's the data I'm accessing. And the story that I'm going to unwind here for us, I think will illustrate what we all believe, which is vehicle maintenance is an overwhelming component of the CSA program, and embedded within that, brakes, lights, and tires are the major contributing factor. And then when you peel that back one more layer to the intermodal group, I think we'll see that what we all believe is in fact borne out by the data. It is of huge concern. You as a segment of the trucking industry are far more challenged by these issues, and I'll try to now tell my story and have you understand a little bit of where that's coming from. But then we get to hear from the real experts, our three operators here with Cliff and Ronnie and Tim, and then I'll step into the background and let them explain how they deal with this in their operations. So this first slide that we're looking at, and again, don't let these overwhelm you. There's just a few points I'm going to pick out of each one of these. Don't try to consume all of what you see here. It'll boggle your mind. So what I want to point out here, first of all, we are now at 50,000 feet looking down on the entire U.S. regulated trucking industry. And what you see here are the categories of violations that exist. This is both CSA and non-CSA. So you'll see size and weight and other non-CSA violations. This is everything. So a little over 10 million violations written in the most recent 24-month period. Now, I'll tell you that I've been doing studies like this now for about a decade, and there hasn't been much change. So when we see the brakes, lights, and tires and the vehicle maintenance focus today, you probably know intuitively this hasn't changed much. Since CSA launched, and even before CSA launched, vehicle maintenance was really the 800-pound gorilla in all of this stuff. So as you can see here, identified by my three red arrows, there's our friends, the brakes, the lights, and the tires. And when you add those three together, of these 10 million-ish violations, almost 30% of those are in just those three categories, brakes, lights, and tires. So in round numbers, amongst friends, call it nearly a third of everything is just those three violations. So that's kind of our first takeaway, is we have once again confirmed that those particular violations are a huge component of CSA. We're gonna actually kind of back off to the side here and then look specifically at the CSA program. So now we've filtered out size and weight and some of those other things. We are just looking at those violations that fall into the 6 measured basics. So the 6 basics that have violations, not the crash indicator. And you can see, holy cow, 77.5%, a little more, almost 80% of all of the violations that flow into the system are in that vehicle maintenance category. So, check a second box as we, continue our study to see whether this is, going the way we think it is. We've seen huge impact of our brakes, lights, and tires, and all packed neatly into that huge category of vehicle maintenance violations. So if we then look at that, we're going to just think of this as peeling back an onion a little bit. We're going to look at the next layer we're peering down into now just the vehicle maintenance category. So we started with everything, looked at the basics. Now we're looking right down into the vehicle maintenance basic. And you can see that 46%, almost half of all the violations in maintenance come from brakes, lights, and tires, or BLT, as I like to call them. Makes it easy to remember. So again, you can see, just how overwhelmingly these contribute: brakes, lights, and tires. Those first, number 1, number 2, number 3, and you add those up, and you approach half of all of your maintenance violations exist in those categories. If we then think about taking that down one more level, which is into your industry, your segment of the industry, intermodal carriers, we start to see something even more interesting. So just so you kind of have an idea of what these numbers look like, McComas reports to us that there are 17,586 motor carriers who self-report that they are involved in intermodal freight. So this is a self-reported number. We all think that's a very high number. There's kind of, I guess, what I would call a casual intermodal. It could be, years ago they carried a container somewhere. We think probably, and I've kind of talked to the folks at IANA who are the experts on this, it's probably something south of half that number that are truly active intermodal carriers. But throughout this analysis, I'm looking at those numbers that we have self-reported by carriers, so a little over 17,000 of you out there that fall into that intermodal classification. So again, now we're still looking at vehicle maintenance, but now we're only looking at intermodal. And you can see that 33%, you make up a third of all the brake lights and tires. So you are a much smaller component of the industry than a third, and yet a third you make up a third of those BLT violations. So very heavily weighted towards your segment of the industry. So I'm going to shift now. That's kind of the what, and I'm going to shift now and talk a little bit about the where. So everybody loves maps. We all like to see where things are happening. We are a physical industry. We go out and about the country. So I always like to include kind of a geographic look at this. So again, we're going to back up now, and we are looking at vehicle maintenance violations. So I haven't gone all the way up. We're still in that vehicle maintenance category, but we're back to the entire trucking industry again. And this is a breakdown of where these violations are coming on a county-by-county basis. So this is the entire industry. There's those 10 million violations and over 500,000 motor carriers. And if you do that simple math, and this is a number I want you to just sketch down on a pad next to your desk, because we're going to come full circle back to this number here in a minute when we get down into the intermodal world. 20 violations per each of those motor carriers, all violations. So just write that down, keep that in your head. That's a number we're going to circle back to, the number 20. Now, you'll start to notice I have added somewhat of an unscientific scattering here of a select group of rail terminals, of ports, and of border crossings. Those are the labels you see attached. And you start to see some interesting things just in all violations. You start to see the colors start to brighten up, going from yellow to red, which means a much higher number of those. So you start to see our story is, in fact, starting to tell us that when you look at these places where you intermodal operators primarily focus on, the ports, the border crossings, the rail terminals, you start to see the sky gets brighter with these things, and that starts to inform our story here. So what we've done now, we're peeling that same onion back, and we're going to look at the same period, but again, just at the vehicle maintenance violations. So we've gone, look at the number, 13 violations. So again, we've reconfirmed that packed into vehicle maintenance is the overwhelming majority. So we only lose 7 violations per motor carrier that are something other than maintenance. And again, you see the same kind of brightening along the borders, at the ports, at some of these rail terminals where this inspection activity is much, much higher. So again, in our ongoing quest to peel this back, I want to go now just a little bit further down, and now we're going to start to look at just intermodal. And this is intermodal all violations, so we're looking at everything. And again, you start to see even, the rest of the country starts to get a little thin. You see a lot of white spots there where the violation activity drops to nil. and yet we still see these border and port areas kind of lighting up the sky. So a lot of activity there. And then let's see, now we're going to go down. We're still looking at that. We're in intermodal now, and now we are just maintenance again. So again, we just, if we think about peeling that onion back, we're going back through the same little portal here from the industry through maintenance back down to intermodal. So now we are looking at intermodal carriers only, and this is why I want you to remember that 20 number. You now are at 29 maintenance violations per carrier in the entire United States versus that 20 that we saw before. So you're at a much higher rate than the industry as a whole. And then finally, the number that really starts to catch our eye is when I now remove the rest of the country, and now I'm only looking at those identified ports, border crossings, and rail terminals, and the number jumps significantly. Now the intermodal industry, is faced with, data here shows us 38 maintenance violations per motor carrier for each of you when you limit it only to look at these port areas. Now, it might be interesting here. One more thing I just want to point out. When I looked at this, you remember we talked about there being something like 17,000 intermodal carriers. When I looked at these key port, terminal, border crossing areas, I only found evidence of about 3,000 of you who actually have any inspection activity. So I filtered this out. So if you look at the math, you may wonder how it works out to 38 based on 17,000. We're not looking at 17,000 anymore. There's only about 3,000 of you, and I think that starts to get closer to the real number of active intermodal carriers that are active in these port and border areas. And again, I haven't captured all of them. There are certainly other ports and rail terminals, but I was just trying to kind of give us a sampling. Next slide, and I'm going to have to get through these here quickly. I'm going to go through pretty quickly. This last map that we're going to look at now just drills down to that final layer of just BLT violations. So we now get to your segment of the industry, 16 brakes, lights, and tires violation per each one of you motor carriers when you look just at those port and terminal areas. So very high concentration there. All right, now there's a few slides left, and I'm going to get through these pretty quickly because I think you'll find the story is interesting. So this is a timeline, and just real quick, I'll explain it once. The blue area that you see on the screen is the trending of inspections since 2010, since the CSA program launched. Above that, the orange bars are the number of violations that are uncovered in those inspections. And then we have citations in red. We have the number of engaged law enforcement officers. So those are the number of unique inspection officers involved week to week. And then finally at the bottom are the CSA points generated by these inspections and violations. If you notice the number of inspections, there is a slight increase in overall the number of inspections over time. You can see that trend line behind. So that's the starting point of our story. If you look at the number of violations, they're very flat. So this is something, whenever I do this analysis, I always give a shout out to the industry, because what this shows is even with heightened enforcement scrutiny, evidenced by the number of slightly increasing inspections, your violations are flat, and therefore the number of violations per inspection is reducing. In other words, your inspections are getting cleaner. All of this focus on CSA and inspections has had the effect of a lot more focus on these violations across the entire industry. So I think that's a very good thing. The other piece that I want to point out, CSA points, very flat. So there has not been a lot of change over time. There are some interesting spikes here. So you'll see that about every year you see a spike here up, and about every year you see a spike down. In June, these upward spikes, we statisticians call that road check, and the December spike statisticians call Christmas. So you can see there is some seasonal effect. There are some very specific programs that drive those numbers. All right, now we drill down to vehicle maintenance, and you'll see that even more dramatically, now we see inspections flatten out. So there really is very little increase in the number of inspections, very little change in the number of violations with those same spikes, and the resulting very little change in CSA points. So where we see the entire industry getting cleaner, when we get into vehicle maintenance, we don't see that so much. We see pretty much the same activity today that we did, 5-6 years ago. And now let's take our drill down a little further. And then I'm going to wrap this up and hand it over to the experts. So the intermodal carriers, vehicle maintenance only, you're going to see that we have now start to see a story that I think speaks well towards your segment of the industry, because now all of a sudden, again with relatively flat inspections, now within the intermodal area and maintenance, whereas the rest of the industry is flat, intermodal is doing a better job. You see that decreasing line in violations and the resulting decrease in the CSA points. So I think that's something this segment can point to as evidence that you, perhaps more than the industry at large, are making progress on this vehicle maintenance monster. And then finally, specifically with the brakes, lights, and tires, even more dramatically, because you know this is such a big, important part of vehicle maintenance, it appears that the focus is even stronger, the number of violations dropping even more dramatically, and the CSA points following close behind. And then the final two, simply break those two things in. I think they both tell the same story. We're looking at tractors now and trailers, and I'll jump to trailers because the story continues to be the same. Whether it's tractors or trailers, in the brakes, lights, tires category, great progress, fairly consistent inspection activity, a little bit downward there, but again, an absolutely dramatic decrease in the number of violations, and the CSA points follow that. So we hear a lot of people say, you know, we work hard on this stuff, but our scores don't always get better. And right there before our eyes, I think, is evidence of why. It's because the entire intermodal segment is getting better. You all work on this and appear to be making great progress. So that's my quick run through of my story, and I think the rest of the time will be better served by having the experts talk about their specific strategies as to how they attack these problems. So I'll hand it over to Tim Smith with Hub Group to take it from here. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks, Steve. The first thing I'm going to say is that it's amazing how much data there is out there available to us in so many different sources and so many different points, that figuring out how to take that data and, to your point, tell a story with it really becomes our primary task. Is what should that story be? What actions should we drive from that story? And what are the results that we expect, and what are the results that we attain? And so that's kind of what I'm going to focus on, and that's what I've put together as sort of my talking points for the group. And so as we get into it from a Hub Group perspective, we primarily pull our data from the FMCSA website that Steve referenced, the MCMIS website, but we also utilize the Vigilo software programming and the ability to access that data within Vigilo, really focusing on utilizing the custom groups and being able to then break that data down into smaller working units. Sorting and segregating and identifying key targets and trends is really important. So between the two of them, that's primarily where we pull our data from. We also obviously pull in DVIR, daily inspection data, as well as observed performance on our yards. But so then we get into what are we doing with the data, and we sort that data out by location, equipment type, and driver type to be able to then break it into more, am I looking at tractors in this particular region? Am I looking at a chassis issue in this region? Am I looking at a company driver or an independent contractor issue in these areas? How can I coach that, and how can I use that information then to drive my messaging to a very focused audience group? But we also then break it down by violation type, whether it be brakes, lights, tires, or others. Converse to Steve's numbers, as he's showing, brakes are clearly not our largest point getter or our violation count. It's all lights. And it's interesting to see that. But when I think through that, I think a big portion of that is probably because we don't see those chassis violations related to brakes. Those obviously get pushed to the IEP. So as a motor carrier, those numbers don't hit our records. But we still talk about them. We still make sure that we're conducting the right vehicle inspections. So we push that out in a daily format out to every terminal location, every driver's manager, every terminal manager, every regional manager, and every safety manager out to our fleet, broken down by location and by driver type, and identifying by brakes, lights, and tires the violations that they've received the day before, what those look like as a relation to points, and how their month-to-date CSA score for that particular location is. Then we monthly compile all that to give them an annual CSA score based on their actual data. And I can then drive that by tractor or by trailing unit. And I emphasize the difference between trailing unit because we incorporate both chassis and company-owned trailers, but heavily dominated by obviously intermodal chassis. But from there, we're able to identify by vehicle type, by driver type, and by location what that score is weekly, monthly, daily, and obviously annually. We take that data and build our messaging platforms around it then. And our messaging platform flows similar to that from a standpoint of, is it a global fleet messaging campaign? Is it a regionally targeted campaign? Or is it a specific to a terminal message campaign? And even breaking down further, are we specifically targeting our owner-operators and their vehicle inspections and this particular area of that vehicle inspection as a focus point, or is it driven at the company driver? Is it driven at the group as a whole? So we utilize the data and pull that together from a standpoint of where it's coming from and where it's being driven to. That daily CSA score drives a lot of that on a local level, but the daily CSA score doesn't drive the regional and national level. That more is driven by the monthly and the ongoing CSA score as a whole. From the data, then obviously we're also able to focus in resources. So when we look at resources and how we built plans and allocated strength and those resources to specific markets or specific areas, we identified a couple of years ago that one of the biggest things that we could do would be to implement a team of vehicle inspectors. And they are past law enforcement folks, and we targeted the areas. It's kind of funny and ironic that based on Steve's map, they're in exactly the locations that Steve calls out as being the heaviest areas for violations and or points over the past 24 months. But in Dallas, as an example, we have a vehicle inspector on site that is responsible for both random inspections of our chassis that come on and off the yard, as well as our tractors coming on and off the yard, regardless of independent contractor and or company driver. That inspector absolutely has the authority to put that unit out of service on the spot and require those repairs to get done, and we do so. So we drove resources to those areas, we drove resources to those targets, and we move those resources to geographical blitz areas. So if we know that we've got a trending issue in an area, we might send our team of vehicle inspectors to a specific terminal location and conduct random, essentially level 2 inspections and drive into the level 1s where we see the need. But each one of those is driven off of that data that we've gained, that data that we've pulled, and those issues that we've identified. We obviously locally build those messaging platforms and campaigns based on the data, and that's all locally coached and communicated with the expectations to our drivers, but we also don't overlook our vendors. So if we see a particular area in a vendor or in an area that's popping up, we make sure our vendors know about those upward trends, and as needed, we will send our vehicle inspectors over to work with those vendors and ensure that we're reviewing the right components and that we're conducting the vehicle inspections not only the way that we want them done, but in compliance with the legal requirements. We also require our independent contractors on a 90-day interval basis to provide for us from an approved vendor or from one of our vehicle inspectors a full annual inspection. We go to the 90-day to help identify those issues and get ahead of them more quickly. And once we have found a violation, or a violation has been found roadside, not when we found one, but when it's found roadside and it's written up on a DVIR or a DVER, we follow a pretty strict pattern about the follow-up to that. We require that in addition to the DVER being submitted immediately, we also require a capture of that day's DVIR, and we retain both, and we ensure the signatures for compliance for the repairs being completed and the vehicle now being safe to operate on every one of those. That happens through our vehicle safety inspection group as well as our safety management team. They also then take that back and they review the previous DVIRs and the previous inspections that should have indicated or caught whatever that defect was. In conjunction with that, as well as that driver's past or historical performance, we review it with the driver, the safety manager, and the driver's manager, as well as the maintenance representative on what was missed, how did we miss it, what are we going to do to ensure that we catch it the next time around, or any similar defects the next time around. And then collectively, we set out an action plan for that driver and follow up to observe and correct whatever behaviors resulted in him or her missing that defect the first time around. So it's a pretty robust system and process that's all driven off of the data. And does it work? It absolutely. We've seen some huge returns on our information, not entirely inconsistent with what we see from Steve's numbers and data, but I think at a much higher threshold. So we've seen a 38% reduction in our total points in the last about 2 years and a few months. We've seen about a 32% reduction in our inspections, and we've also seen about a 9% reduction in our overall measure score. And obviously, Steve's question or comment was, we work and we work and we work, and we see a reduction in our points and our inspections, but our measure scores don't always seem to move as much as we want them to, or the percentage doesn't move as much as we want them to. And part of that is still driven back by the mathematical equation that says it's still a number of points found per inspection that drives our measure score. And so if both of them are reduced, then mathematically the measure score follows that same pattern and ultimately drives that percentile. So it's understanding the numbers, it's getting into the numbers and getting into the weeds a little bit, but then being able to take that information out, drive the messaging out to the front line and to the drivers at hand, and gaining ownership into the programming. And I think we're going to hear a little bit more about that. But the other major statement from us at Hub Group is our mantra to our field and to our operators is absolutely, if it's not safe and compliant, don't move it until it is. And driving that message home to everybody involved throughout the process is really the key at then taking the actions that you've taken, the plans that you've executed, and driving the results that you need. And it's that commitment that is required to end with the product that ultimately we're expecting and predicting. So with that, I'm going to wrap up and let this conversation move on to Ronnie.
Thanks, Tim. And good afternoon, everyone. I certainly appreciate, Ayanna, the opportunity to tell TCW's story about our maintenance basic. First, let me point out I am not a maintenance expert. I wasn't asked to talk about maintenance, but talk about our score. That's what I want to talk about, because our score is a good score, especially from a intermodal basic. I hear that a lot, but it always hasn't been that good. And we do believe in the philosophy, good is the enemy of great, good is the enemy of great, and I believe it can be better. Our score started off when CSA was first introduced in 2010 as right under the intervention level. And when we looked at the numbers, we saw that 80% of our violations were in lights. So we put programs in place, training. We started providing all terminals and drivers lights to repair the defects before they operated equipment, changed the philosophy, and 2 years later, it took 2 years, we had that number back below 30. So it was just a matter of communicating, and that's our biggest form. I believe, I was taught early on that share the stress. So that was from Gary Holbrook that taught me that. Instead of just keeping it in, let everybody know what we're trying to work on, and believe in the Deming philosophy of what gets measured gets done, or at least what gets measured gets attention. So how do we communicate? We use several different forms of communication here at TCW. It starts off every day. We'll send a daily safety message via email to every employee at the company. I understand not everybody looks forward to getting that email and is going to read that email and has the self-discipline to read that email. But we have contests throughout the year giving away big screen TVs and other nice prizes to keep everybody's attention, and we get a pretty good feedback from that. At all of our terminals, we have electronic message boards that will help communicate not only the safety message, but also other items that are going on at the terminal. Each quarter, we'll have a safety meeting. I think most companies do that, and discuss these scores. And our CSA scores are shared with the fleet every month when they're updated. We use the Vertical Allowance Infinity training platform to provide training and communication with our fleet. In fact, our last training video that went out was on how to properly replace a light, the things you should do before you replace it. We use the PeopleNet satellite message to communicate the message to them. And then one of our best forms of communication is peer-to-peer with our Master Coach program. Our Master Coaches are drivers at each terminal with a desire to help not only TCW but other employees succeed. And each of those drivers have a tablet with access to the Vigilo system, which gives them access to the driver scores, their terminal scores. Like Hub Group, we do break it down by terminal and post it. And, each terminal knows which terminal has the lowest CSA numbers. It's all about communication at TCW, is trying to share that information. Hopefully, the CSA numbers are just confirming that our programs and initiatives are on track. We're looking at these inspections every single day, and we'll put a program or initiative to try to fix whatever areas we got. And then when we look at the CSA numbers at the end of each month, we'll get a good idea if our programs are on target at that point. So with that said, I'm going to turn the program back over to Cliff with Norfolk Southern Corporation.
Ronnie, thank you very much. Okay, and I'm going to shift away from my IANA hat and just look at NS as a intermodal equipment provider, and tell you that NS uses the data that we get from FMCSA along with data we collect ourselves to really drive our whole program for proactive systematic maintenance. And I'll rattle off a few things here, really trying to help set up some of the general discussion. But first off, in the data that Steve showed and that we've showed at the IANA meetings in the past, the simple reality is a lot of the federal inspection efforts are focused outside of our service territory. California and Texas are roughly 2/3 of the federal level 1, level 5 inspections. And we really don't get any further west than Kansas City with most of our fleet. So as a result, we need to do a lot of self-inspection to get the data we need to drive our programs. So to that end, we've really scoured all the available information sources. We do go on FMCSA's IEP portal Monday to Friday, pull down any new inspections so we can capture those units and get to work on those. But beyond that, we tap all the repair data that we can. We look at road service repair and try to tie that back to the terminals and the individual mechanics that did the last repairs and the systems that need to be maintained while they're on highway. We look at on-terminal repair trends, awful lot of time spent on that. We will mock FMCSA audits where we get as close to a real FMCSA audit as we can based on our experience with those, to use our own personnel and third parties to try to create that condition in the terminals and see what we learn about ourselves and our vendors from that. We have data that comes in from post-repair audit, post-in-gate audits, which might not be the most intuitive audit to do, but we've learned that a really good way to assess the health of your fleet is to wait for units to be parked that came in from the highway and look at it then. It's a good way to give feedback on your in-gate process and on the DVIR process and on the overall health of your entire maintenance and repair system. All of the DVIR, DVER repairs, try to track those back to figure out, where the units were last repaired, who did the repair, they use the components we were looking for, et cetera, et cetera. And really, the thing that makes a lot of that possible is, and makes a lot of the data mining possible, I would say, is electronic work orders. We invested in an electronic system where we put a personal computer in the hands of every mechanic, and it's integrated with a built-in cellular card, so we've got real-time communication back to us. It's got camera capabilities and all that. And it's all intended to let us collect a lot of data about what the mechanic's doing, but also it's setting up functionality we haven't deployed yet, but given us the ability to see the unit that the mechanic is working on and check the mechanic's qualifications for the repair he's about to do, and start setting up the ability to deliver training to him. So capturing data from that specific unit that's about to be repaired to deliver training, I think will be pretty helpful for us. Keeping going down the list, we will look at our repair data and the violation data that we collect internally and externally based on the design of the equipment to see, for example, on lights, incandescents versus LEDs. We'll just say anecdotally, we're one of the fleets that participated in the IANA study about converting from incandescents to LEDs, and absolutely no question about it. As we converted more and more to LED in our fleet, our violations related to lights just plummeted, absolutely plummeted. So fantastic tool for anybody who's still operating incandescent lights. We do a lot of analysis looking at the components that we put on our equipment to try to measure the lifetime cost for them. The kind of the trade-off of maybe you want to invest in a higher quality part to get less frequent replacement. So we use data to try to look at that quite a bit. It's really trying to set up what internally, and I'm sure externally, some folks would call the holy grail in maintenance, and really get to predictive maintenance programs. And We've done it in very limited fashion to date, but I'm excited about what the future holds for us there. Vendor performance is another thing that we can use the data for, so we can see where we've got clear differences in capabilities from one vendor to another one. I mentioned the training delivery, which I'm pretty excited about. And then last one, and this is again a very near-term launch that I'm excited about, is tying back the in-gate inspections that we do as a facility operator to look at the repair orders and start scoring the motor carrier and driver for DVIR compliance and the in-gate personnel at the facilities for their inspections, trying to add focus on the things that are going to matter the most to help us and our customers on the pools that operate off our facilities with their compliance efforts, and that's looking at lights and tires, and surprisingly not brakes, but chassis locks. Because, of course, in a gate environment, I don't expect a gate clerk to see a lot of brake issues, but certainly tail lights and tires and chassis locks can be seen in a gate environment. And then last thing for data collection, we learned an awful lot as a fleet owner as we shifted from what I would call the traditional walk-around inspection to making the investment in the quality of our program to add electronic testing. And we evaluated numerous devices that were out in the market in that space. And now it's a requirement at all of our facilities that you hook up chassis to electronic test equipment to simulate air and power being delivered to the chassis so that you can check out those all-important systems for lights and brakes, and for us, also automatic tire inflation systems. We use those for every single annual inspection that we perform on our fleet. We use them to respond to the DVIR and DVER that come in on our equipment. And then we use them for quality audits. And I would say of all of our information sources to drive maintenance, the work orders that have electronic testing associated with them is probably the most fertile ground that we have to really try to improve the quality of our fleet, particularly on the air system side where you don't get that feedback from the gate. You hope to get it on the physical components and on the lights, but the air systems, we really rely on that systematic use of electronic testing. That is how we use the data to drive our programs. So you've now heard from Hub Group with their approach as a motor carrier, and TCW with their approach, and on the same lines, and then you've heard now from a fleet owner. So Hal, I'll turn it over to you for the Q&A session.
That's great. Gentlemen, thanks for the insights. Really interesting. Great to get perspective from three very different but three very dedicated organizations that are working really hard to understand what's going on and make a difference with the data. We've got some interesting questions coming in. I'll just jump right in. The first one is the Vigilo data showed improvement across both tractor and chassis in terms of number of violations and violations per inspection. But is there any data breaking out what percentage of violations are for the tractor versus the percentage attributed to the chassis? So that one's obviously for Steve.
Yeah, good question. I mean, the answer is yes. I did not prepare that specific analysis on this webinar, but that certainly is an interesting thought. We could produce that. I suppose I could do that and add it maybe to the deck before it's distributed. But so it's just a breakdown percentage of violations tractor versus chassis.
Frequently when we're talking about intermodal equipment, we really focus pretty closely on the chassis, sometimes the container. Rarely talk about the power unit, but it's very rare to see a self-propelled intermodal chassis. So it's interesting for us to tap into that line and really kind of get more realistic about what a lot of folks are struggling with, that many motor carriers have their own chassis, they're kind of growing their own small chassis pool. So there's some interesting stuff there.
So can I add to that from a fleet perspective, if you don't mind? This is Tim at Hub Group. And I'm going to plug Vigilo for a minute. Inside Vigilo, a big focus is that we've driven is off of the observable defects, and it certainly calls it out in the Vigilo programming to show you and help you understand that where those visible defects are drawing the attention of the inspectors, although that what they see might not be the significant violation and points, it is what draws that inspection to start with. And so the more you reduce the visible observable defects, the greater impact you're going to have on a reduction of your inspections as well as hopefully your violations and your overall points. But clearly a huge focus area that I know that TCW has focused on and we focused on. We didn't mention it, but it is a big portion of every one of our messages is the observable defects.
Here's another question. How about distinguishing the violations attributed to the motor carrier versus the IEP, even though the violations went to Unit 2?
I guess that's one for me, Steve, again, probably. That one's always been tricky for us. The IEPs are not well identified in the MICMAS data. That's something we've talked to FMCSA about for years. Again, probably something I could dig into. Maybe I can find out, get an update on that and see where we stand. It just hasn't been well documented, but certainly an obviously interesting question. I'll add it to my list to see if there's something I can add before the slides are distributed.
Here's an interesting one. How do these numbers compare to the Canadian market? Are there higher violations in winter versus summer?
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't have access, or I've never spent time looking at Canadian data. If you mean Canadian motor carriers operating in the U.S., that could absolutely be broken out, but we don't have access to Canadian data. It's not as well organized. I know that's not something people associate with CSA data, but it is actually aggregated at the federal level, and in Canada it's more at the province level. It's harder to get a hold of. So I don't have good guidance on Canadian data.
Makes sense. Here's a good one. This one sort of riffs a little bit on kind of what you were touching on, Cliff, at the end of your thoughts. Has your data analytics program led to changes to your equipment recommendations or requirements? So I think basically where they're getting at is, have these data analytics programs driven the kinds of equipment that you're requesting to have either put on as new or replaced on your chassis?
I'd say absolutely. As we looked at, for example, brakes out of adjustment, we saw pretty quickly that there was an opportunity for us to significantly reduce that one by changing our replacement standard for slack adjusters and for brake chambers that we install. So we went ahead and made those decisions to make our replacement components ones that would help us on those scores. And we also used it to launch really in-depth training about looking for underlying foundation brake issues before you try to adjust a slack adjuster.
Speaking of brake,
the same way with incandescents versus LEDs. I mean, when you looked at the data, it was very, very clear that once we found a way to secure an LED light in a chassis, we had much better performance with that light. So that was absolutely another data-driven decision to change the design of our chassis to have internally mounted LEDs, and then also now to just the sheer mechanical reliability of an LED light versus incandescent to convert the remaining incandescent fleet to LED as quickly as possible.
Piggybacking on that a little bit, here's a really good question. The data shows two different categories for lighting. One was clearance identification lights, with the other simply being lighting. What's the difference in these categories, and are both included in the percentages presented?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, those just to completely shield myself from any belief that I did this. These categories are completely created by the FMCSA, so these are of their making, and we report on them as is. But the short answer is yes. When I do the analysis on brakes, lights, and tires, there are multiple categories for all three of those. There are multiple brake categories, there are multiple light categories, and there are multiple tire categories. Two tire categories. So yes, the short answer is those are all included when I did the analysis.
Okay. Here's one, kind of a quick one. Where does the intermodal market see the movement to air disc brakes going?
I'm not sure who you're directing that at, but from a carrier standpoint, on our company-owned trucks, disc brakes are absolutely where we're headed.
Got it.
I think both carriers represented on this call are both already there.
Yeah, and for chassis, we're at least starting to look at it. We'll likely get pricing for air disc brakes this year for the first time.
And I think it's worth noting that those aren't necessarily compliance-driven decisions. Those are also safety-related and driven decisions, and not to diminish the value of either one of them, but the stopping distance and the reliability of those disc brakes is repeatedly proven to be significantly better than the drums.
Here's one on tire category. What is the breakdown of bias versus radial tire issues? Do we have a breakdown of new tire issues versus retreads? If not, how can we add these categories?
I don't think there's any of that detail in the data. I don't think we get that from CSA. It would have to come from some group of, that would be a project somebody like IANA would have to take on with its members, I think.
And Hal, what I would add there is the recent efforts to expand the global intermodal equipment registry that IANA maintains, to let fleets identify the type of tire on their equipment, will help us give answers to questions like that in the future. That initiative was really just kicked off this year, and IANA is still campaigning with the equipment providers to populate it.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time. So first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for participating, our distinguished panel, and our terrific audience out there. Thank you for all the great questions. I want to draw everybody's attention to some upcoming webinars. We've rounding out the year with some interesting stuff, and I think some things that will particularly speak to some of these issues. On October 25th, there's a webinar called Overview of Enhancements to Gear and Bows Applications for Intermodal Equipment Providers. On the 26th of October, there is an overview of IANA's bad order equipment status bows application for intermodal providers, facility operators, and maintenance and repair vendors. On November 14th, there's a webinar called Where Is It? An Introduction to Smart Equipment and Intermodal Asset Tracking. And that'll take an interesting look at, particularly on the marine side of things. And December 5th, we're rounding out the year with The Truth About DVIRs, the key to road-ready equipment. So that'll dive into the DVR component. Finally, if anybody has any other needs for information about Intermodal or IANA, please visit intermodal.org or email us at info@intermodal.org.